Let's see. From the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we have Pascal Chan, Vice President, Strategic Policy and Supply Chains. From the Federally Regulated Employers, Transportation and Communications, Danielle Safian, President and Chief Executive Officer. Christopher Pigot, Partner, Fasken Martineau Dumoulin, LLP. And from the Union of Safety and Justice Employees, David Alexander LeBlanc, Assistant Director, Negotiation Section, Public Service Lines of Canada. Each will have 5 minutes to give your opening statements, then we'll go to questions. We'll begin with Mr. Chan for 5 minutes. Mr. Chan.
Très bien. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Vice President, Strategic Policy and Supply Chains at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, which is Canada's largest and most activated business network, representing over 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across the country, as well as 200,000 businesses of all sizes in all sectors and all areas of the country, working to create the conditions for our collective success. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier les membres.
I would like to thank members of the committee for inviting me and for leading this study. We spend a lot of time talking about economic growth, productivity, and the place of Canada in the international, in the world stage. We are a trade country. International trade represents 2/3 of Canada's GDP.
That impact our supply chains yet sit outside of our control continue to grow. The COVID-19 pandemic, extreme weather events such as wildfires and floods, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, attacks on merchant vessels in the Red Sea, historic drought in the Panama Canal. The next obstacle is surely just around the corner. And here at home, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we must be doing everything in our power to protect our ability to trade, but you'd be mistaken. Our Business Data Lab's analysis of Employment and Social Development Canada data revealed that in 2023, we lost the most working days to labor disruption since 1986. Last year, the Canadian rail network ground to a halt, and then later our largest East and West Coast ports shut down simultaneously. Looking back a couple of years, you can add in Vancouver grain terminals, the St. Lawrence Seaway, 2 major airlines, the BC ports again, along with an overwhelming strike mandate for Canada Border Services agents. When it's all said and done, it really feels like we're outright progressed to flaunting how little we care about ensuring that businesses can keep the lights on and cut the paychecks Canadian workers use to provide for their families. And this hasn't gone unnoticed. Canadians are concerned. A recent survey conducted by Nanos Research revealed that Canadians are 11 times more likely to say that the federal government is doing too little when it comes to ensuring labor stability and the reliability of our nation's critical supply chain, while the majority of respondents are also concerned about the impact of labor disputes on the affordability and availability of goods. Additionally, Statistics Canada's Canadian Survey on Business Conditions revealed that in Q2, exporters, usually among the most optimistic businesses, were trailing other firms with that advantage completely eroded, the drop reflecting supply chain disruptions, tariff anxieties, higher costs, and softening demand. The Bank of Canada has raised the pressing need to increase productivity, noting in its assessment that our nation has trade agreements granting us better access to global markets than any country in the world. But along with that access comes opportunity, and the world increasingly needs what Canada can provide. We've got the resources to meet the world's demand for food and energy security, but we risk squandering that opportunity if we don't act with urgency. Étant donné notre situation actuelle, on ne peut pas prendre pour acquis le libre-échange avec les États-Unis. Le Premier ministre a déclaré son objectif de doubler nos exportations envers les pays autres que les États-Unis. Ah, pardon.
The translation.
Testing interpretation. Testing in English.
En français.
Ouais, c'est bon, désolé.
Testing in English. I will go back. Given our current situation, we cannot take for granted our free trade with the United States. The Prime Minister told us that the goal is to double export with other countries in the United States over the next 2 years. It's essential to put in place infrastructure for trade, and we also have to convince our international partner that we are literally able to deliver. Trade is a matter of trust. Canadian companies cannot offer their goods in the to the international market without that trust. We have to change the Canadian Labor Code for all trade infrastructure, and we have to give the cabinet the power to act when everything else has failed. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me and for working to build a good nation for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chan.
Statement.
Well, we're sharing the time.
Fine. Proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Daniel Safiani, and I'm the president and CEO of FETCO. That's the Federally Regulated Employers in Transportation and Communications. I'm joined by Christopher Picket, partner at Fasken and counsel to FETCO. He'll speak shortly to the legal dimensions of the right to strike and the usage of 107. I want to thank you all for inviting us here to contribute to your study. FETCO, by way of background, represents private sector employers in Canada's federally regulated sectors. So that's major railways, ports, courier and logistics firms, the banking and the finance sectors, and airlines, all of whom fall under the Canada Labor Code. Collectively, these sectors represent over $543 billion annually. That's roughly 16.5% of GDP. They employ more than 2.1 million Canadians, and that's 12% of the national workforce, with wages that are on average 45% higher than the national average. So these are, simply put, some of the best jobs in the country. These employers are the kinetic pillars of Canada's economy, moving our goods, people, capital, energy, and information. Together, they form the backbone of our domestic and international supply chains. In short, every other sector of the economy depends on their reliability. And in today's unsettled geopolitical and trade environment, stability and reliability are prerequisites for investment. Labor uncertainty threatens not only domestic operations, but Canada's credibility as a trusted economic partner. Now, the federal government has set out an ambitious nation-building agenda and economic reform plan, one that depends heavily on federally regulated sectors. Yet, these sectors remain very constrained by a collective bargaining framework that simply hasn't kept pace with the times. Reforms have been largely reactive, piecemeal, and politically driven, resulting in rigidity, operational efficiencies, and higher costs that ultimately dampen job creation and investment. So that's why we very much so appreciate the committee's attention to these issues, and just want to begin with a few high-level points. First, employers believe in collective bargaining and the right to strike as fundamental and foundational aspects to a healthy labor system. We believe the best and most durable agreements are the ones freely negotiated by the parties at the negotiating table. Second, arbitration is a last resort, not a strategy or a preferred outcome. Employers are not looking for government to rescue negotiations or run out the clock to force intervention. Employers want agreements reached through good faith bargaining. Nobody wants a third party who may not understand the business or the workplace environment coming in there and penning their collective bargaining agreement. Third, when nationally critical sectors are at stake, the framework needs a credible backstop that protects the broader public interest. Most federally regulated disputes, as this committee has heard, are resolved without a work stoppage. The challenge is that small number that arise in sectors where disruption can cascade across supply chains and impose costs on other workers, businesses, and communities. In those rare but high-impact circumstances, government needs a modern, balanced framework that keeps parties bargaining, respects the right to strike, and protects the economy when the national supply chains and critical systems are at risk. With that, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Chris, who will elaborate on the right to strike and the usage of 107 in the Code.
Thank you. As it stands, the Supreme Court of Canada's case law is absolutely clear that the right to strike is not absolute. In fact, Canadian courts have held repeatedly that government-imposed restrictions on strike activity can be constitutional, where the parties have reached impasse and further negotiations would be futile, or second, where the right to strike is replaced with a fair and balanced interest arbitration process. The bottom line is that the Charter allows the Canadian government to intervene in collective bargaining disputes to end negotiation impasses and the damaging impacts of work stoppages. Recently, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice has issued several decisions that confirm these principles. In a case called OPSU, the court found that back-to-work measures that ended a lawful strike would not violate the freedom of association if collective bargaining between the parties had stalled and there was no hope of reaching a negotiated collective agreement. In a different case from 2024 involving the 2018 work stoppage at Canada Post, the Ontario court found that back-to-work legislation was a reasonable limit on charter rights because it established a fair and balanced interest arbitration process to resolve the bargaining dispute. These findings are consistent with the Supreme Court's decision in Saskatchewan Federation of Labour, where the Supreme Court said that while a total permanent ban on strike activity might violate the freedom of association, such a ban could be saved as a reasonable limit where the right to strike is replaced by a meaningful dispute resolution mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pigot. We'll now, I believe I may have missed David Neufeld, the national president. My apologies. Mr. Neufeld, the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. Are you making the statement on behalf?
I am, sir.
Good. You have the floor for 5 minutes, Mr. Neufeld.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is David Neufeld, and I'm the national president for the Union of Safety and Justice Employees. And I'm pleased to be here as part of your study on the definition of work and the use of Section 107 in the Canada Labour Code. I'm joined today by David Alexandre Leblanc, Assistant Director of Negotiations and Research Branch of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. USJE is one of the several component unions of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. PSAC represents nearly 240,000 workers who live and work in every province and territory in Canada. USJE represents over 19,000 members in 18 federal departments across the country, and USJE members also belong to the PSAC, which acts as our members' bargaining agent. USJE falls under the mandate of the Departments of Public Safety and Justice. USJE's two largest departments are the Correctional Service of Canada and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. USJE members belong to a diverse variety of occupational groups within the federal public service. This includes administrative services, general labor and trades, hospital services, data processing, the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders in the federal correctional system, and they also form the operational backbone of the RCMP. Now, I would like to start by saying that only certain sections of the Canada Labour Code apply to the work of USJE members, and therefore we would not be affected by a Section 107 order. However, this issue does have broader implications of the 173 bargaining units and nearly 13,000 members represented by PSAC that are covered by the Canada Labour Code, as well as for the collective bargaining rights of workers across the country. Now, let's be clear. No one takes the decision to go on strike lightly. Workers are fully aware of the implications of withholding their labor and the very real impact it will have on their livelihoods, their families, and their communities. Strikes are seen as a last resort and are only taken after union members come to the decision that no further progress can be made at the bargaining table. A strike is considered to be the most powerful lever available to workers to maintain a balance of power with their employer, and it is vitally important that this constitutionally recognized right be respected. That's why the sudden increase in the use of Section 107 is concerning. Although Section 107 has been in existence since 1984, it was rarely used. However, in just the past 2 years, the federal government has used Section 107 8 times, often forcing workers off the picket lines days or even hours after the work stoppage began. This alarming trend undermines workers' constitutional right to strike and is raising real concern that employers in federally regulated sectors will not meaningfully engage in the bargaining process, knowing the federal government will intervene to end a work stoppage. In fact, we are seeing employers proactively request the federal government to use its powers under Section 107 even before workers have gone out on strike. We believe that the federal government has recently been implementing its powers under Section 107 in a way that is placing unreasonable and potentially unconstitutional restrictions on the rights of workers to strike and is no longer fit for its purpose. It is time for Section 107 to be abolished from the Canada Labour Code. Along with the PSAC, we are calling for the government to either bring its own legislation or support existing legislation that removes Section 107 from the Canada Labour Code. The NDP has already put forward legislation to scrap Section 107 in the form of Bill C-247. If the government truly believes that the best deals are made at the bargaining table, and we hear that all the time, then they need to let bargaining happen without interfering to the process. It can show its commitment to protecting the constitutional rights of workers by repealing Section 107. Employers need to be sent a message. The government is not here to bail them out of difficult negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neufeld. We will now begin with our first round of questioning, beginning with Mr. Reynolds for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming today. Appreciate your time, especially coming here in person. I think that adds lots to committee. My first question is for Mr. Neufeld. So, with collective bargaining, the very foundation of the relationship between the employer and its unionized workforce is based on the ability to collectively bargain in good faith, and I think that's a key point to make, is in good faith. Do you think the government's use of Section 107 undermines that relationship?
Okay, sorry, I was waiting for the chair to let me speak. So yes, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I do believe that it's important to be bargaining in good faith. And yes, Section 107 grants the minister sweeping and discretionary powers to allegedly maintain or secure industrial peace, including directing the Canadian Industrial Relations Board to do such things as the minister deems necessary. When invoked preemptively or early in a work stoppage, it suddenly changes the rules of the game, and it interrupts the economic leverage that workers lawfully exercise to move an employer toward a negotiated settlement, and thereby undercuts the bargaining dynamic that good faith negotiations rely on.
With the government's tendency to rely on Section 107 to force unionized employees back to work, and the respect of unions to binding arbitration, which prevents strike action, do you think this process is shifting the contract negotiations in favor of the employer?
I would say in practice, yes. Strikes and the credible threat of strikes is the primary tool in which rebalances the power at the table. When Section 107 is used to order a return to work and impose arbitration before a strike achieves its purpose, the employer's exposure to economic pressure drops sharply. That tilts the playing field. The incentive to make the move at the table is reduced when parties expect the government to step in and employers can delay meaningful negotiation in hopes of ministerial intervention. With the frequency of which Section 107 has been used in the past 2 years, we are concerned that employers are beginning to anticipate the government intervening in the work stoppage. So this could dramatically change the dynamics of a negotiation if the employer can confidently operate under the assumption that it can reduce the incentive for employers to compromise.
Which is what we saw with Air Canada. Obviously, the executive at Air Canada had no intention of bargaining in good faith. Do you think that this process leads to unions and its members feeling cheated out of their right to collectively bargain? In good faith, of course.
I would say yes. The Supreme Court of Canada has recognized the right to strike as an integral, meaningful collective bargaining tool under the Charter. And while Section 107 is a statutory power, Using it to preempt or neutralize strikes undermines the legal purposes of strikes of Canadian labor law and fuels the sense that unions are being denied a fair process. The federal government's pattern that has damaged the confidence and provoked challenges at the CRB and in federal court again reflects that members feel cheated and compelled to litigate rather than negotiate their rights.
Do you think that union members are losing faith in the collective bargaining process and their rights to collectively bargain in good faith?
I would say many are. When the government repeatedly stops lawful strikes and unintentionally swaps bargaining for arbitration, I think members observe the legal mechanism they are democratically choosing, the strike, is somewhat neutralized. So that doesn't mean that union members will simply give up. We've seen as recently in the use of Section 107 orders that it's ignited a broader response from unions across this country. Using the Air Canada strike, as you had mentioned, members even defied the order and quickly got to a tentative agreement. That, to me, is a prime example that free collective bargaining does work when it's allowed to work, and it highlights the damage and, frankly, the chaos that can be caused by premature intervention.
What would you say to unions that might help restore the faith in collective bargaining?
Well, as I mentioned during my opening comments, I really believe that in order for that to happen, it requires structural change. The repeated use of Section 107 to override the strikes and impose arbitration has fundamentally weakened confidence in collective bargaining. So to rebuild the trust, we call on the government to repeal Section 107 from the Canada Labour Code. We think that recent abusive use of this provision has given the minister sweeping powers to terminate strikes, which undermines the constitutional right to strike and the principle of good faith bargaining. Removing Section 107 would ensure that negotiations remain between the parties and not that of the government.
So with the government's use of Section 107 forcing unions to the labor relations, the CIRB, would you consider that a conflict of interest in federally regulated industries since the CIRB is a federal crown corporation?
I think legally not on its face, but perceptually it raises concerns. The CIRB is an independent and quasi-judicial administrative tribunal established by a statute, and it operates, as you said, at arm's length from the government. That institutional setup is intended to avoid the conflict of interest. However, I think that Section 107 structure, allowing the minister to direct the CIRB to take specific actions, creates the perception that the board is implementing executive directives rather than neutralizing, evaluating the merits. That dynamic understandably fuels this perception of bias.
Thank you.
Reynolds, your time is up. Madame de Rochier pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here in person. And thank you for preparing to show in committee.
Very much. So you were talking about earlier about FETCO, basically responsible, the whole sector and all of the employees responsible for 16.5% of, the GDP in terms of the sector that it involves. And you talked about 2.1 million jobs, right? Could you talk a little bit about, out of those 2.1 million jobs, how many, direct jobs, how many indirect jobs are involved? And I know you probably don't have a figure, but, for every cargo of rail and grain that is moved, for example, there are farmers, there are people collecting that grain. What is the impact, I think, the indirect impact of this? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the numbers that I was quoting were very conservative direct numbers used from StatsCan, and that's work that FETCO undertook because we actually don't have a clear understanding of the direct impact of federally regulated sectors and what they actually mean to the economy. The actual aggregate impact is much larger, and that's the general comment about every sector and industry, and you heard testimony earlier from the Canadian Federation from Independent Business, how every small business depends on the reliability of federally regulated sectors. So I think what is often missed in this debate is that it's characterized, and we even hear that just now in the testimony, as a labor versus employer issue. But when the West Coast ports went down in 2023 for 13 days, that affected the labor movement across the country. We actually, and you don't hear this in the headlines, but there are union leaders of paper mills and steel manufacturing plants that was pushing for the usage of 107 to bring the workers back and have a fair resolution to the CBA. That's something you don't often hear about because it does impact workers, and oftentimes workers that don't have the benefit of wages that are roughly 43% higher than what you're getting in federally regulated sectors. And so I do think that that's an important point here because it does impact workers across the country and communities when reliability is interrupted.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And maybe I'd like to turn to Mr. Chan now. So you talked a little bit about our need to increase productivity. You talked about the importance of our GDP, two-thirds of our GDP focusing on international trade, relying on international trade. Can you talk a little bit about what is the impact on Canada's reputation abroad when our grain growers are not able to ship their products? Is the country that's buying it going to rely on us when they don't know if they can or cannot get it next time around?
Yeah, the simple answer is no. I mean, listen, we run a number of trade missions to other countries. We're in a lot of places and we speak with delegates from other countries. Are we going to be a serious player on the international stage, or are we going to show that we can't reliably deliver, they can't count on us, or are they going to continue? I've heard that some are looking at collective agreements before they're deciding to do business with Canada. I mean, you asked about some of the data. The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade has estimated that almost $10 billion in cargo was disrupted during the 2023 BC port strike. The St. Lawrence Seaway, that was a little bit after. It looked like economic activity impacted had reached about $900 million. The railways stoppage, our business data lab saw that they disrupted about $3 billion worth of revenue ton miles for major carriers, CN and CPKC. I mean, I can go on through all of this, through a number. I mean, look, the terminal elevators at the Port of Vancouver receive just over half of all the grain produced across Canada. I think that's one of the things you mentioned. And so, when they handle and export most of the grain that farmers in the prairies grow, this is a strike that stopped nearly 100,000 metric tons of grain that flow through those terminals daily, resulting in a 35 million in potential exports lost every single day. So I can share a lot of this. Yeah, I can keep going, if you want. Also, the Port of Montreal, almost $400 million worth of goods pass through there every single day. Additionally, if you look at 2021, Transport Canada carried out an analysis of the impact of a shutdown and results. Oh, sorry, you're done.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, because I do have one more question, and I only have one more minute. But thank you so much, and I really appreciate. I think you're right. That's what's missing in this debate, because I know that we're talking about even 13,000 workers, or but it's much beyond that, the impact. And so I guess my last question, I don't have a lot of time, but is for you, Mr. Neufeld. What you said, we should completely do away with Section 107. So how much economic damage you think should be considered before we take action to end a strike? How much economic damage is enough on all of Canada?
So again, I represent members that are not impacted by 107. So it's hard for me to comment on what type of economic damage would be acceptable. But what I would focus on, what is the responsibility of the employer to come to the table and negotiate fairly? I'll use the example of Air Canada. It was very clear that Air Canada was waiting for the government to take action with 107 and allow airline stewardess and stewards to do unpaid labor. The Canadian public came on board and said, this is ridiculous. Who would show up for work and do all that free work? They help take care of us on these airlines. And, some of us here in the room, we use Air Canada, we use other airlines, and other airlines are going to be dealing with the same thing. I think Canadians understand when things are hard, trying to make ends meet, that includes these workers who deserve a fair collective deal, and also to make sure that they get paid for the work that they do. So I would put the onus on the employer. Come to the table.
Thank you, Mr.
Negotiate
Neufeld.
fairly.
Thank you.
Merci, Madame de Rocher. Madame,
Thank you, Madame Durocher. Madame Gill, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here with us today. Here's a good example of the two poles in this discussion. This is a very interesting discussion. We become devil's advocates sometimes when we're asking questions because we understand the importance of free negotiation, but we also understand that our supply chains need to be strong and the importance of productivity. So sometimes we're put in a bit of an uncomfortable situation, but hard questions are the most useful. You talked about something that is important for their study, but we haven't talked about it all that much. The definition of work. Mr. Neufeld, you talked about the definition of work for airline workers, but I would like to hear every witness say, what do you think about the fact that there is no definition for work in Part 3 of the Canadian Labour Code? So from right to left, Mr. Neufeld, Mr. Chan, and Mr. Safai. Or Monsieur Leblanc.
To Monsieur Leblanc pour la réponse.
For the answer. Yes. I think that we are here to talk about the usage of Section 107 for the definition of work. I think that for many years, the Canadian Labour Code has been working well when it comes to collective bargaining. The minister was here earlier to say that 97% of work disputes can be solved without a strike. So in our point of view, adding a definition in the Canadian Labour Code is not a priority for now in our bargaining. This is not something that comes up. We don't. Sorry, you talked about flight attendants, and you talked about maybe if there was a definition of work, maybe the situation would have been different and they may not have had the same challenges as they did. But we don't represent flight attendants. No, but you talked about it. It's the other part of our study, so I will like to ask Mr. Chan and Mr. Safai to also answer. I will let Mr. Safai answer because this is not something that's very relevant for us. Merci.
But I just wanted to make two very quick points, which was, it keeps being asserted that employers are not there bargaining in good faith and trying to reach a deal. I would just like to understand where the evidence for that is coming from, that negotiations are not being done in good faith from employers. That is not my understanding of how it's been working in these disputes. And just on the flight attendant pay issue, and Chris is going to speak to greater detail about the definition of work, but the government is undertaking an inquiry into this right now, in which FETCO and Pascal's members as well has participated in. So I look forward to hearing about what the truth of the matter on that actually is, because again, that is not my understanding of the compensation formula for flight attendants.
Thank you. One of the challenges with the federally regulated industries that are subject to both Part 1 and Part 3 of the Code is that it's quite unusual, actually, particularly in the transportation industry, for employees to be paid on a standard hourly wage or a salaried model. Instead, you have often very complex systems of credits and non-time-based compensation schemes that determine how much someone is paid. The flight attendants present a great example. Flight attendants are not paid solely based on time. They're paid based on a very complicated system of credits and guarantees that apply to their compensation. And so with respect...
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm almost out of time. So if you'd like to send your answer written down, that would be great. I know that this is not the main topic of conversation today, but I was wondering if a definition for work could have changed something in negotiation for flight attendants. Could this have facilitated the bargaining to have a definition of work, according to you?
Define work in a way that made sense across the federally regulated industries. And I'd be very worried about the unintended consequences of trying to create a one-size-fits-all definition of work that then needs to be overlaid over, collective agreements and compensation schemes that are decades old. I do worry about unintended
Oui,
consequences.
c'est la difficulté qui se pose aux différents législateurs.
Yes, these are the difficulties that we are facing as members of parliament. So I can't ask a second question in 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Gill.
To Ms. Goodrich for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here with us today. This is such an important topic, and you guys have all brought a variety of different perspectives on such a wide space. I guess one of the questions I have, and perhaps I'll start with Mr. Safayani, the use of 107. You explained that it's complicated. Like, there are other workers that get hit in those supply chains when work stoppages happen in certain spaces and places. Do you believe that one potential solution to increase transparency and accountability would be to have that every time Section 107 was used, that it had to come to Parliament to be debated and explained why it was required?
I think okay, I'm good. So it's a good question. And the provision has recently been used in a way, and I think that this is important to mention here, that's being actively tested in the courts, and FETCO is participating as an intervener representing the employer perspective in those cases. So I do think it's premature right now for Parliament to simply remove Section 107, as has been asserted here and by
removal. What I'm specifically asking about is if it was to continue as is, would it be something that, to create some accountability, to make it so that every time the government were to use it, they would have to bring it to Parliament to have a debate on that?
And I guess where I was getting to with my answer is that the judiciary system is right now clarifying its proper scope and limits. So I do think it's a little bit premature to front-run that process because they're going to be taking a look at this and making a determination on its usage and whether there should be those types of additional constraints added to it. But let me just say this. We are very open to a discussion, and I don't think this is something that should just come from labor or management and business, but to exploring alternative tools and modernizing the framework in a way that works for all sides and all parties and gets us to where we need to go. I'm not here to suggest that this should be a fully baked solution.
I've got a very limited amount of time. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off. Mr. Neufeld, the same question. Like, do you think that making it so that Parliament would have to have a conversation on the use of 107 after the fact would be a compromise in some way?
Well, I think, as it's been pointed out, that currently many collective agreements are done without having to go to 107. And I think the question you're asking, is there a perception that by bringing it to to Parliament for a vote, that would create additional oversight? I think that the perception may be that might be a better way to do things. But again, I think our position has been very clear about removing 107 from the Canada Labour Code and allowing the unions to negotiate a fair collective agreement with their employers outside of that. And I'm going to turn over to David Alexandre. We'll see.
Yeah, if you will allow me. And our position is also informed, but the Canada Labour Code already contained provision for the minister there's various things that the minister can do in the context of a labor dispute. They can appoint a commission, as we've seen in the Canada Post's recent strike. They can name a mediator to help the parties come to a resolution. And they can also force an employee vote on the employer last offer. So it's not like there is no other resources in the Canada Labour Code right now for the government to help the parties get to an agreement. So we see 107, the recent use of 107 as a bit of an overreach.
And I think you point out something very important. Like, this has existed in the Labor Code since 1984. So, like, over 40 years, it was used very sparingly for the first 38-ish years. And in the last 2 years, it's just been out of control. And I think part of why it's been out of control is because wages have not been able to keep up to inflation. And inflation is directly caused by our government's out of control spending. And so do you think that if we could get inflation under control, that might help ease some of the concerns around labor unrest in this country? To either yourself or Mr. Neufeld.
Well, what I can say, again, our members are not impacted by 107 of the section, but I think, to your point, are Canadians more generally concerned about cost of living and making ends meet? Our union members feel the same way, making ends meet. We have many people in our public sector that make wages that they have to work multiple jobs. And so what I would say is that as long as employers are not coming to the bargaining table to negotiate in good faith and drag this out and expect the government to come and bail them out and bring them back to work, it creates a very tenuous situation for union workers across this country.
Thank you, Ms. Goodrich. Madame Koutrakis pour 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for this important study and for your important testimony. I will begin my questioning with Mr. Safayani. You said in your opening remarks that labor stability threatens Canada's reputation. Employers believe in collective agreement. You said mediation, last resort. Employers believe in good faith bargaining. And we need to make sure that we protect our economy. So from your experience, what kinds of practices help maintain stable and constructive labor relations and prevent disputes from escalating? Because our government believes that the best deals are made at the bargaining table. So if you could share a little bit about your experience and what you've seen, what you've heard.
Yeah, no, in my experience, dialogue is important here. And speaking of your government, I applaud Minister Hajdu's announcement just recently forming an official advisory tripartite table, bringing together labor, business, and government together in the same room discussing these issues. Over the last 10 years, that has not necessarily been the case. There have been a number of kind of ad hoc changes to the Canada Labour Code that were not really done in full consultation with the business perspective there. And the result of that is a system that is less agile, not modern, and doesn't account for the fact that, you know, largely the Canada Labour Code was built in a post-war era. So it did not contemplate an integrated and globalized supply chain. That's why, you know, when Pascal speaks of the enormous economic impacts, you know, that the system is not really designed to handle that and deal with that in a fair and balanced way. You know, again, I do have to call this out because we keep saying, we keep hearing employers are not showing up in good faith, inflation and wages are not fair to the worker. Okay, well, there's currently a pilot strike that's about to be underway at Air Transat. That negotiations have been ongoing with that since January of last year. Okay, so it's been 12 months nearly. Pilots have been offered a 60% increase in wages over 5 years, the majority of that happening within 1 year. 90% of the CBA has been agreed upon, and there's no other side right now to negotiate with. So I'm wondering just where that notion is coming from. And the reason I mention that is that the relationships to your question here are important. Having a dialogue, having a space in which we can examine on an evidence-based way what aspects of the code are working, what aspects of the code need to be modernized so we can avoid a type of dispute that starts in one corner of the country but very quickly cascades and has enormous ripple effects and ends up holding the entire economy hostage. There was a question earlier about how much economic damage is enough economic damage. We didn't get an answer to that.
Thank you for that. And this is why it's so important when we heard through the Air Canada flight attendant work stoppage about the alleged unpaid work, the first thing that the minister did was to order a probe. We are anxiously awaiting to see what that probe will come. It's imminent, the report, and I look forward, as I'm sure all of us on the committee are looking forward to that evidence, because it's important to know every Canadian that works should get paid for the work that they do. So I think that was an important position taken by the minister. She acted quickly, and I think it's important information that will help every Canadian. My last question is to Mr. Chan. In your testimony, you said the members of your organization feel that the government is not doing enough to protect trading. Could you talk to us a little bit more why they feel that way and how can the government be doing different?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. I mentioned, first of all, that they feel that not enough is happening because of the list of major labor disruptions that we've seen that have impacted our economy. And in addition to that, one of the roles the Chamber plays is kind of convening. So we talk about the 200,000 businesses, but also all the industry associations that represent all sectors of business. Over the course of the last, I would say, 2.5 years, we've written a number of letters to the minister trying to raise concerns about these upcoming labor disruptions, and they've been signed by about 115 industry associations from all over and about 125 chambers of commerce as well, including, I mean, some of them that are represented in this group: Ballaford's and District Chamber of Commerce, Cold Lake Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Fort McMurray Chamber of Commerce, the Sherwood Park and District Chamber of Commerce, and the Atlantic Chamber of Commerce. So again, in communities represented by the MPs sitting around the table here, they have serious concerns about what these labor disruptions are doing, not only in the transportation sector, but down the economy and in all regions of Canada, where the movement of these goods is critically important to their survival. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Koutrakis. Madame Gill, pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Gill, for 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I was still expecting waiting for 6 minutes. You can answer in writing if you don't have time. We were talking about structural reform. Mr. Safayani talked about other issues, so this could open up the field beyond Section 107. Mr. Safayani talked about good faith. I am not calling into doubt the good faith of any parties or the contents of any bargaining, but we want things to work well. And just like you, ideally, we'd like things to work quickly and to the satisfaction of all parties. Are there any specific areas that we should investigate? What would you suggest? I know this is very broad. Maybe you can answer in writing if you think of anything else. Thank you.
Je vous laisser discuter entre vous.
I can let you guys decide how to answer.
With the code more broadly that FECO and our members find problematic, what I was speaking to over the last 10 years is the 10 paid mandated sick days and how that is actually manifested. And that is not to say federally regulated employers are against paid sick leave. We are in favor of it. But what has the way it's actually been implemented, it's been, what Chris warned about earlier, unintended consequences. So it's just actually overriding existing collective bargaining agreements and adding an additional 10 paid days based on employees that already had 10 paid sick leaves. That's problematic in how that's been implemented. The outright ban on replacement workers has left organizations in a situation where they are going to struggle to keep basic and critical services running that Canadians rely upon in the event of a small disruption. And just to put a pin on this, you can now have a small localized bargaining unit of maybe 100 people in a 30,000 people organization, and the ripple of effects could shut that entire organization down the way the legislation has been written. Now, last point here on 107, which is what the committee is investigating. I think we need to acknowledge the problem and urgency. We are not advancing a ready-made alternative today. What we are saying is that the government needs to look at intervention tools potentially beyond 107, and that should be built around a few clear principles. Number one.
Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill. Chair, could the answers be sent in writing? Yes.
The answers to Ms. Gill in writing to the committee clerk. We'll now move to Ms. Falk for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. So, Mr. Chan, I'm going to start with you, if I may. Just pulling from what I have heard throughout the discussion, but also in your opening testimony, you have said we have what the world needs. I 100% agree. In Saskatchewan, we have potash, we have uranium, we have canola, we have natural gas, we have oil, we have every single thing that not only fuels people, but fuels the world and what their comings and goings is. In an ethical way, in an environmental way. I would say the most environmental in the world is how far I would go. I am so proud of my farmers and my energy workers. Does your organization support the escalating fertilizer tax that is on our farmers?
The escalating
The fertilizer tax that our farmers are paying for, and it seems to be going up quite regularly. Does your organization support that?
I was going to say, I'd have to check it with my colleagues. I can't speak to that at the moment. I apologize.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can get back to you with an answer.
How about, yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah,
I would love if your organization could supply that. Because I know what my chamber members at a local level, what they think of those taxes and what they think of those punishing taxes on the ability for them to grow their business. I know what they think of that, so I'd like to know what the national organization thinks. My second question for you, Bill C-69, does your organization support the No More Pipelines bill?
Do we support the No More Pipelines
Yeah,
bill?
Bill C-69.
Bill C-69.
Implemented under...
Clearly.
This is not relevant to the study. We're studying Section 107 of the Labor Code.
Thank you, Ms.
Right to
Madame
strike.
Desrochers. Ms. Falk, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Does your organization support Bill C-69?
Yeah, I can get back to you on another question.
That would be wonderful. I would like to know that too. How about C-48? That is the shipping ban for tanker traffic on the coast of BC.
We have not been supportive of the tanker ban, and we know that we need to increase our exports out of the West Coast. So I can get back to you with specific details about that.
How about C-69 though? Because we need to pipe that oil to the coast in order to put it on a tanker to get it to the world to trade it. Yep. So I'm just surprised that your organization doesn't have a position on C-69 then.
Oh, it's not that we don't have a position. I wanted to,
what is the position?
I want to confer and get you the actual position from my colleagues who are specifically in natural resources and in agriculture as well.
Okay, I look forward to receiving those positions.
And we've also just produced
the
a paper
other thing
on
that you mentioned in your opening statement was cabinet should have the power to act when everything else has failed. What does that mean?
That means, again, we talked about two options. One is providing the federal government with more tools.
Just a moment.
Yes?
Is it a translation, Mr. Joseph?
L'interprète a du mal, moi, il y a deux personnes qui parlent en même temps.
No. Translation is fine. Are you on the right channel?
Deux personnes qui parlent en même temps, Monsieur le Président.
Oh, no. Ms. Falk.
Point of order. I'm just very curious. It seems to be like this is being used to just try and interrupt my colleague, Ms. Falk. Our bloc colleague who is listening in French is saying that there is no translation issue, so I'm just wondering if we can have some clarity because they can't just claim translation issues in a way to interrupt.
Thank you, Ms. Goodrich. There is now a point of order there, and I've stopped the time. Ms. Falk has her full 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Well, continue. You used up
for sure.
2:47.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chen, what does that mean? The cabinet should have the power to act. when everything else has failed?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And so there was two things that I optioned. One, first of all, that the federal government should have more tools to be able to address dispute resolutions. And that is when we look at the process right now and we've gotten to a place where we're not able to, or parties are too far from an agreement, that they could appoint a special mediator that would be able to make recommendations to both parties as well as to the Minister of Labor in the situation where all of this has been evaluated and make a recommendation on whether or not they should act. And then that would provide a little bit more substance to the recommendation if government needs to act in the case that there is too much economic damage potentially on the table that could be caused.
So when I look at Bill C-5, which I would argue was expedited through this Parliament in June, it's actually been the only piece of legislation that this government's been able to do anything with. Ironically, they've done nothing with C-5. I mean, this C-5 gives Cabinet the ability to exempt major projects from several different laws like C-48, like C-69, the industrial carbon tax, as well as the emissions gas cap. So I'm just wondering, is your organization encouraging the government to use the powers that they have within C-5 to get major projects built so that we are able to trade our exports?
Yes, absolutely. And we've also made the point as well, and I'm happy to share additional resources on this, that we need to make sure that we don't create a two-track system where only projects that are deemed of national interest are the ones that progress, but also other major projects
that are progressing at all.
No, I said we need to create the major projects.
Right, no, but my point being is we have no projects being created at all.
Yeah.
Like, what are new projects?
And so
even this two-track thing, I don't even know if that's real because this government doesn't move anything along on a major projects. I mean, look what we're debating in the House today on the MOU on pipelines, on this pipeline with Alberta. I mean, they have the powers that was given to them in June to do that, and they're not doing that. So I don't actually think this Liberal government cares about jobs, cares about trade, or cares about diversifying our trade agreements and partnerships with other countries to get our products, which are the best in the world, to those markets.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. That's your time. We'll conclude with Ms. Fancy, and I would remind members again the issue if one is talking over the other, it cannot be translated. And that was the point of order Mr. Joseph raised, which is accurate. We'll now go to Ms. Fancy to close at 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. Through you, Chair, I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here in person. I agree with my colleagues today that it is nice having everybody in person as it creates a more relational type of atmosphere. So let's pick up with what my colleague was trying to do with her questioning or her line of questioning, but I want to rephrase it in terms of our government's investment and expansion. So my first question would be to Mr. Chen. In regards to the federal budget, including major investments in infrastructure and in trade corridors. I'm from Atlantic Canada, so I'm a touch point within trade, both nationally, regionally, internationally. I'm wondering, could you provide us with, do you think that clarity in the labor definition would improve certainty for employers considering investments in Atlantic regions?
I think, I'll say this. I think that greater clarity or greater predictability instilled in our tendency to see all of these labor disruptions, more predictable and favorable investment for our environment for attracting foreign investment is a large determinant in that. And so addressing a lot of these issues as well as increasing our capacity to trade with other countries by expanding major infrastructure all factor into the equation as to whether we're going to improve our reputation internationally and whether we're going to be able to take advantage of those elements to diversify our trade.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I wanted to give you time to say what you wanted to say from my other colleague. My next question is actually for Mr. Pigot. Thank you very much for being here today. In the beginning, you talked about a couple of case studies and things that were had already been done, so precedents. So I'm wondering, are there precedents? You had mentioned one on, I believe it was OSHU, and another from a case from 2024. I'm wondering if you could expand on those and showing how unclear definitions have led to disputes or financial penalties that could deter investment in smaller rural markets. And I say smaller rural markets because I myself am from a rural riding in Nova Scotia.
Thank you for the question. I think perhaps the best example that would speak to your question is the 2024 decision that I mentioned, in which the Ontario Superior Court found that back-to-work legislation that ended the 2018 Canada Post labor dispute was a reasonable limit on charter rights. In that dispute, an ongoing period of rotating strikes had, basically shut down Canada Post. Canada Post is not as important as it used to be, but what the courts have found in this regard is that it's still vital to rural, remote, and northern communities.
In terms of balanced reform, thank you very much for that. And it's something to recognize as well that 97% of disputes are completed without any type of government standing in. So in terms of balanced reform, because I think that's what we're trying to get out of this study, if Parliament considers reform, how do you think that statutory language both enable employers to meet these labor market needs, as well as protect workers from a misclassification, unpaid overtime, or an erosion of rights?
I think that if Part 3 of the Code is going to be examined and amended, it needs to be done in a comprehensive way that avoids the sort of piecemeal one-off changes to specific terms that creates unpredictability for employers and impacts employers differently depending on what industry they are in. So any reform to the definitions in Part 3 of the Code, I think, calls for a comprehensive review that has both employer representatives and worker representatives at the table to figure out what's working and what's not. And through that review, hopefully any definitions, whether related to work or any other minimum standards that are unclear or not doing the job they need to do in the 21st century economy, could be reviewed and jointly agreed upon changes could be made.
Wonderful, thank you. And I have about a minute or so left. I have one last question for you. Thank you very much, Mr. Pigot. From a legal perspective, what do you feel are some of the most significant risks that our ambiguous definitions of work, which is what we're trying to define here within this study, pose, particularly for small or mid-sized employers operating in rural regions?
The biggest challenge is that if the legislation doesn't provide clarity on the term, either the workplace parties or ultimately arbitrators or the courts need to try and figure out what to do. And so that uncertainty just continues down the pipeline and then impacts business on the ground as they're trying to operate.
Thank you, Ms. Fancy. That concludes the first round. I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing today and providing testimony on this particular study. With that, we'll suspend for 5 minutes while we transition to the next panel. Suspend.